It was a quiet morning in late May, May 31, 2014, when three 12-year-old girls walked together into David's Park in Waukesha, Wisconsin. They were laughing, they were carrying a backpack and a sleeping bag, and to anyone watching, it looked like a normal weekend playdate after a birthday. They left the park at different times. One of those girls crawled out of the woods later that day, bloody, confused, and barely clinging to life. Her name is Payton Isabella Leutner. She was 12. They said they did it for Slender Man. That line, those 4 words, changed the way America talked about the internet, about children, about mental illness, and about criminal responsibility. Today, on this episode of Still Unanswered, we're going back through that day, through the years that followed, and, more importantly, through the questions that never really went away. I'm Rachel Klein. With me is Dr. Marcus Ellison, a forensic psychologist who has worked with juvenile courts and with adolescents experiencing psychosis. Marcus, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me, Rachel. It's an important conversation, and not an easy one.
Right. Let's start, very briefly, with the basics so listeners are grounded. Then we'll unpack the psychology, the legal decisions, the aftermath, and the still unanswered questions. Marcus, can you very simply outline who the 3 girls were and what happened that day?
Sure. Morgan Geyser and Anissa Weir were both 12. Payton Leutner was 12. Morgan and Payton had been friends since elementary school. Anissa was later in the circle. On May 31, 2014, Morgan stabbed Payton 19 times in a wooded area at David's Park. Payton crawled out. A cyclist called 911. She survived after extensive surgery. The 2 girls, Morgan and Anissa, were later found carrying a knife and said they were on their way to live with Slender Man. The legal aftermath is complicated, and we'll get into that.
Complicated is right. Before we dive into the courtroom and the diagnostics, I want to do what feels almost like an act of accountability. Name Payton first as a person and not a statistic. Marcus, a surgeon, later said, if the knife had gone the width of a human hair further, she wouldn't have lived. That's a brutal image. Payton survived. She has scars, physical and emotional, and she has chosen, in time, to speak about what happened. We'll center her story through this episode.
Absolutely. Payton's survival and resilience are central. And as a clinician, I want us to remember the human cost as we talk about systems and theories. This wasn't just a case file.
Okay, segment 1, walking through what actually happened. I'll tell the scene and you can stop me when we need to unpack a point, Marcus. Cold open. It began at a birthday sleepover. The girls went roller skating, got frozen yogurt, and later were allowed to go to the park. To Morgan's mother, it looked like a typical birthday. But that evening, unknown to Payton, the plan was already in motion. Conversations, rehearsals, and a belief system that Morgan and Anissa had developed privately, online, and together. At some point, the girls lured Payton into the woods under the ruse of hide and seek. Morgan ended up on top of her. Morgan used a 5-inch kitchen knife taken from her home and stabbed Payton 19 times. Arms, legs, torso. Wounds to the diaphragm, to the liver and stomach, and one wound that scraped near a major artery. Payton somehow crawled out to a road where a cyclist found her and called 911. Morgan and Anissa then walked away from the scene. Hours later, they were found near Interstate 94, roughly 5 miles from where Payton had been left. They had the blood-stained knife with them. They told police they were on their way to Chickamauga Nicolet National Forest to live with Slender Man.
Rachel, quick, 2 things to underline. 1, the distance they put between themselves and the crime scene suggests some planning, some forethought. It wasn't an instant, impulsive flight. They hid the knife, they carried it, and they were attempting to head hundreds of miles to a place they believed to be Slender Man's domain. 2, the words they used, Slender Mansion, we are proxies, were not casual references. For Morgan, especially, Slender Man had become a persecutory figure. She believed he'd kill her family if she didn't comply. That level of belief points to severe psychosis.
We'll return to that psychosis language. For now, listeners, these are real kids, 12, and yet the state charged them as adults under Wisconsin law. Morgan faced attempted first-degree intentional homicide. Anissa attempted second-degree. Those charges set the stage for a legal and ethical battle. Do you treat these acts like adult criminality or like expressions of profound mental illness in children?
Exactly. And there's an additional clinical wrinkle here. Shared delusion, or folie à deux. The evidence suggests Morgan was the primary psychotic individual and Anissa the more suggestible follower. That dynamic matters for both understanding culpability and shaping interventions.
Let's slow that down and explain it, Marcus. What is shared delusion, and how does it manifest in preteens?
Shared delusion, folie à deux, is when 2 people, usually close, share a delusional belief system. Clinically, we often see a dominant individual with primary psychosis whose fixed false beliefs are then adopted by a more passive or suggestible partner. In adolescence, social pressures, identity formation, and susceptibility to peer influence make this dangerous. When a primary psychotic teen, like Morgan, frames a mythic figure as real and omnipotent, a friend like Anissa, already socially fragile and craving acceptance, can adopt that belief wholesale. They reinforce each other. It's important to emphasize, Anissa may not have had schizophrenia. She may have been swept into a system of belief that felt real because of her relationship with Morgan.
Thank you. Listeners, it's not a cinematic cult moment. This is a clinical process that can, in rare cases, turn friendship into conspiratorial validation of violence.
Right. And we have to be careful about language like Slender Man made them do it. The story provided the framework, the mythology, yes, but clinical conviction, psychosis, and relational dynamics created the lethal combination. Most kids read scary stories. They don't plan homicide.
Let's pivot to segment 2, where Slender Man came from, because understanding the myth's origins helps separate hype from reality. Marcus, you grew up with internet-native teens in court. Give us the quick origin story of Slender Man.
Sure. Slender Man began in June 2009 on Something Awful, a Photoshop contest. Eric Knudsen, online name Victor Surge, posted black and white altered photos of children with a tall, faceless figure in the background and short caption blurbs. From there, it went viral. Creepypasta sites, YouTube series like Marble Hornets, fan art, games like Slender the 8 Pages. It became collaborative folklore, a digital myth that grows as people add sightings and variations. For many users, it's a fictional, shared game of storytelling.
And yet the media response after the stabbing was immediate and dramatic. Police warned parents. Commentators talked about dark and wicked things online. There was moral panic. Some of it was warranted. People were frightened. But some of it oversimplified the causes. Can you help us map where the panic got it wrong and where it got it right?
Yes. Where Panic got it wrong, the notion that exposure alone, for example, reading Slender Man fan fiction, will turn an average child into a killer. There's no epidemiological evidence for that. Millions of kids played the games and read the stories and never committed violence. Where Panic got it right, the Internet provided a rich and emotionally arousing mythos that could be co-opted by a psychotic mind. The online environment reduced friction, access to vivid images, first-person accounts, and an echo chamber of horror that may have reinforced Morgan's delusions. So the Internet was a vector, not the cause.
So, vector, not sole cause. After the attack, the creepypasta community tried to respond. Fundraisers for Payton, statements that they didn't condone violence. There was public outreach. But the question remained, what duty do platforms have? Is content moderation a reasonable expectation, or are we asking too much of creative spaces?
It's a tough balance. Platforms and communities can and should discourage real-world harm, but policing every piece of fictional horror is neither feasible nor necessarily effective. The key point is not censorship of horror. It's education, media literacy for youth and caregivers, better mental health triage in schools, and mechanisms to identify when immersive fandom crosses into fixed beliefs that impair reality testing.
Which brings us to the legal arena. Segment 3, Inside the Courtroom and the Clinic. Both girls were charged as adults. Prosecutors argued the acts were premeditated. Defense argued age and mental illness. Ultimately, both were found not guilty by reason of mental disease or defect and committed to institutional care. Anissa, up to 25 years, Morgan, up to 40. Marcus, how typical is that outcome for a case where mental illness appears to have driven the crime?
It's not typical in the sense of volume cases of this exact nature are rare, but the structure is familiar. When severe mental illness meets violent acts, the criminal system often opts for commitment rather than long prison terms if the defendant lacks criminal responsibility. In Wisconsin, the insanity defense led to committed treatment. The long maximum durations, 25 and 40 years, reflect both a therapeutic intent and public safety concerns.
The question that resonates, especially in our still unanswered lens, is whether the system treated them as children whose brains were still developing or as adults who must be permanently incapacitated. Wisconsin law allows children as young as 10 to be charged as adults for serious felonies. Is that consistent with what science says about adolescent development?
Developmental neuroscience tells us adolescent brains are still maturing, particularly the prefrontal cortex, which handles impulse control and long-term planning. That doesn't absolve responsibility in every case, but it does suggest juveniles' capacities for judgment are different from adults. That is why juvenile justice systems historically focused on rehabilitation. Yet legally and politically, horrific crimes often push systems toward adult processing for public safety reasons. The tension here is real. Society wants rehabilitation for juveniles, but also needs to protect victims and communities.
During the trials and hearings, there's a striking image of Morgan talking about Slender Man not only as an internet character, but as an actual persecutor, someone who could read her mind and would kill her family if she didn't comply. She even claimed to talk with Voldemort and a Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle at various times. Those examples were used by clinicians to argue florid psychosis. Marcus, from a diagnostic perspective, how convincing are such statements?
They're highly suggestive of psychosis. When someone believes in multiple, impossible interactions with fictional or supernatural beings, and that those beings are exerting control or threat, Clinicians look for schizophrenia spectrum disorders or other psychotic conditions. In Morgan's case, the pattern delusional persecution, decreased reality testing, disorganized ideas fits with a diagnosis of early-onset schizophrenia. That diagnosis significantly impacts how we interpret culpability because it raises genuine questions about the capacity to understand wrongfulness.
Anissa, by contrast, was described as socially anxious and more suggestible. Psychologists said she shared in the delusion. The legal result was not guilty by reason of mental disease for both, but Anissa was released conditionally after 7 years. That release in 2021 sparked public debate. Was 7 years enough for someone complicit in such an attack?
It's understandable why the public questioned it. But remember, her finding of not guilty by reason of mental disease means the court saw her illness as central. Her conditional release included intensive monitoring, GPS, outpatient treatment, supervision designed to manage risk in the community. Whether 7 years is enough hinges on treatment response, insight, and risk indicators, which the court examines closely. The fact that she has remained under conditions suggests the system saw a path to safe reintegration, albeit highly supervised.
And then Morgan, sentenced to a longer institutional commitment, spent adolescence and early adulthood at Winnebago. Mid-2025, a judge approved conditional release to a supervised group home in Madison with GPS, restricted internet access, and ongoing treatment. She left in November 2025, cut off her GPS, and fled with an adult companion. She was found the next day. In December 2025, the court revoked her release. That sequence raises huge, tough questions about risk assessment, timing of release, and public trust.
Right. From a risk management perspective, conditional release is always a calculated trial, a gradual step toward community living under strict conditions. Escapes or violations can happen for many reasons: impulsivity, relational pressures, fear. We shouldn't automatically interpret one escape as proof of lifelong dangerousness, but it does show the system's judgment can be fallible. The revocation was appropriate legally, but it also reopened wounds for the victim's family and community.
That leads naturally to segment 4, the aftermath, the human stories, the unanswered questions. Payton's story is essential here. She was in hospital for multiple surgeries, but she recovered and returned to school. In 2019, she sat with David Muir on 2020. She said she had learned to accept her scars and intended to pursue medicine. She also slept with broken scissors by her bed for protection. An image of how trauma stays with you.
Payton's response is complex. Some survivors find ways to reclaim meaning. Choosing a career in medicine is a powerful reframing. And some hold ambivalent feelings toward their attackers. Payton reportedly said she might thank Morgan if they met because the experience shaped her path. That's not forgiveness in a simple sense. It's an attempt to make sense of suffering, to regain agency.
And we should underscore the community's response. People came together. A fundraiser called Purple Hearts for Healing Day raised over $70,000 to help with Payton's expenses. That solidarity matters, but so does the public's ongoing need to understand whether justice was served.
And justice is a slippery thing in these circumstances. If Morgan and Anissa recover and live productive, law-abiding lives, is the system vindicated? If they relapse, or if something like the 2025 escape occurs, was the system too lenient? Neither question has a neat answer. We have to weigh rehabilitation potential against risk, and that balance will look different to victims, clinicians, prosecutors, and taxpayers.
Let's take some of the still unanswered questions directly. First, could the crime have been prevented? Were there warning signs that adults missed?
In hindsight, Yes, there were red flags. Morgan's odd statements, her intensity around Slender Man lore, social withdrawal, those can be warning signs. But in real time, they were often interpreted as quirky, juvenile fandom. That's the central tragedy of many such cases. Children's idiosyncrasies are frequently dismissed until a crisis occurs. Prevention would have required better mental health literacy among parents and schools, faster pathways to pediatric psychiatric evaluation, and reduced stigma so families would seek help sooner. But it's not simple. Early-onset psychosis can be subtle until it becomes severe.
Second, how responsible is the internet? Can we pin some blame on the creepypasta forums or the games?
We can say the internet contributed content and a framework for delusion, but responsibility is diffuse. Eric Knudsen created Slender Man as fiction. Creepypasta communities emphasized creative storytelling. The danger lies where fiction intersects with pathology. Platforms can do more to label fiction clearly and to provide resources when users show disturbing behaviors. But ultimately, we must focus on the individual's clinical state and social supports. Blaming the internet alone is an oversimplification.
Third, did the courts handle it correctly, trying 12-year-olds as adults? And were the commitments the right balance between treatment and public safety?
Legally, prosecutors exercised their discretion under Wisconsin law. Ethically and clinically, it's fraught. Adolescents' cognitive development suggests prioritizing rehabilitation. Yet the brutality and premeditation pushed courts toward adult-caliber responses. The insanity verdicts and psychiatric commitments were a hybrid approach, recognizing illness while restricting liberty for public safety. Whether that hybrid is the right answer depends on evolving standards of adolescent forensic psychiatry and public expectations.
Fourth, what should true crime storytellers, podcasters, journalists do when revisiting this case? We aim to inform, but we also risk re-traumatizing survivors. What's the ethical route?
Center the survivor. Seek consent when possible. Avoid sensational detail. Provide context on mental health and development. And use the case to point to systemic lessons, what could be done differently, rather than fetishizing the perpetrators. Rachel, you do trauma-informed reporting. How do you approach that in practice?
We ask, is this story serving the public's understanding or merely fueling curiosity? We avoid unnecessary gore, we give space to survivors' voices, and we include resources for listeners, mental health hotlines, credible information. We also interrogate the systems, what schools, clinicians, and policy can change. We can't pretend these stories are just entertainment. They implicate real people.
Good. And to listeners who want to help in concrete ways, lobby for school-based mental health services. Advocate for early psychosis programs. Push for better training for educators to identify potential psychosis. And resist turning horror media into a scapegoat.
Let's linger for a moment on the human ambiguities. Morgan was 12 when the attack happened. Now she's an adult who, at times, has shown progress in treatment and at times has made choices that suggest ongoing vulnerability. Anissa is living under supervision in the community. Payton is growing into adulthood, carrying trauma and a choice to build meaning from it. Where does society find closure here?
Closure is rarely a juridical endpoint. It's a process. The survivor's healing, the community's sense of safety, and the system's ability to manage risk. For some families, closure may come from seeing sustained accountability. For others, it's the survivor's recovery. The legal system can provide structure, but not emotional closure. That element is private and ongoing.
We're nearing the end of our episode, but I want to leave listeners with some concrete takeaways, some things that remain unresolved, and some things they can carry forward.
Go ahead.
Takeaway 1. Thousands of children read scary stories. Very few commit violence. But when a child's immersion in horror is accompanied by social isolation, disorganized thought, and alarming behavioral changes, adults should take notice. Early psychiatric evaluation can be life-saving.
Takeaway 2. The Internet is a cultural amplifier, not a deterministic cause. We need nuanced policies that combine content awareness with robust mental health services.
Takeaway 3. Juvenile justice is a moral and scientific balancing act. Our systems must be flexible enough to account for developmental neuroscience and severe mental illness while maintaining community safety. There are no easy answers, but a willingness to adapt matters.
Takeaway 4. In telling these stories, respect survivors' dignity. Avoid turning trauma into spectacle. Focus on lessons and care. And finally, on a human note, remember that cases like this intersect with ordinary failures, missed warnings, stigma around mental illness, inadequate resources. They are preventable in a meaningful number of cases if we invest earlier.
Before we close, Marcus, listeners will ask, after the 2025 escape and revocation of Morgan's release, where do we stand now? Is she back in secure care? Are authorities rethinking release protocols?
As of late 2025, Morgan was returned to Winnebago after a judge revoked her conditional release. That's the current legal status. Administratively, episodes like this tend to prompt reviews, stricter release criteria, more emphasis on matching support networks, and sometimes more conservative risk assessments. That said, without full clinical records, we can't comment on whether those changes are sufficient for this individual. It does, though, raise public debate about how cautious we should be in reintegrating someone whose offense was so violent.
And for listeners who want to read more, our show notes include primary sources, the Wikipedia overview, AP reporting, The Guardian's deep dive from 2017 and 2025, Payton's 2020 appearance, and other reporting. We'll link to mental health resources for families who are worried about a child's behavior. Marcus, thank you for walking through these clinical complexities with me. Your patience and clarity help keep the conversation humane.
Thank you, Rachel. It's important to keep talking about these cases in ways that push policy and care forward.
Payton is a living person with scars she carries into adulthood. Anissa is under supervision. Morgan is back in care. The Slender Man stabbing became a national symbol of internet panic, but beneath the headlines are questions about mental health, adolescence, and how we protect children, both potential victims and potential perpetrators. Those questions are still unanswered, and they deserve care, research, and resources, not just horror. If this episode was difficult for you to hear and you're dealing with trauma or concerns about a young person, please reach out to your local mental health services. We include hotlines and resources in the episode notes. I'm Rachel Klein. Dr. Marcus Ellison, thank you. And to Payton, if you ever hear this, thank you for surviving. We'll be back next week with another case in Still Unanswered. Music fades.
Thanks.